Thank you, Andrew. There we go. Okay, got it. Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, so I have the honor of welcoming our presenter, Dr. Richard Erskine, to our SATAA webinar tonight. I think for Richard, it's not night, it's morning.
It's 8 in the morning.
8 in the morning, so good morning, Richard. A bit of background on Richard Erskine. He is a certified transactional analyst, a licensed psychoanalyst, group psychotherapist, and internationally recognized Gestalt therapist. He has twice received the prestigious Eric Berne Award for contribution to the development of both a relational and integrative perspective in TA theory and methods. He's published over 50 articles in the Transactional Analysis Journal, as well as 5 books. In fact, I think there are more now, on the theory and methods of a relationally focused integrative psychotherapy. Richard is an honorary member of SATAA for his early work in bringing TA to South Africa. So some of you won't know this, but from 1978 to 1992, he conducted an ongoing transactional analysis training program in Johannesburg and did several workshops in Durban, Port Elizabeth, and Cape Town. And I think, Sharon Kalinko, you were a part of those workshops and are here with us today. In 2008.
All the others are retired.
Yes. Do transactional analysts ever retire? No.
Not all.
In 2008, I had the pleasure of attending one of your workshops, Richard, at the the TA World Conference that was held in Johannesburg. And I remember feeling profoundly moved by your compassion and deep understanding that you developed with the participants in such a short space of time. It really is an experience that I will never forget. So let me ask everyone here to please join me in giving a warm welcome to our guest speaker, Dr. Richard Erskine.
Thank you. Thank you. I was just sitting here full of memories when you said the storm. I remember smelling the South African earth as the storm came across the Transvaal, and then the lightning and the rain. I think you have storms there like nowhere else in the world. Yeah, and the smell of the earth when the rain starts hitting it, it just lingers in my memory. I've had a lot of good times in South Africa. And in fact, I went during the times when your money wasn't very valuable anywhere else in the world. So I used it to go on safaris. And so I've had some fabulous memories, both in the bush and in the workshops with people. So today, people asked, I think it was Karen asked me to talk about scripts and that. There's so much that are written on script that I thought it'd be easier just to take you through my understanding of it. What's in forefront in my mind when I'm sitting there working with a client or when I'm doing supervision. And I'm going to talk from a psychotherapist perspective. I have done coaching in businesses, I've done business management and that, but I am really a psychotherapist at heart. And so that's where my examples will be. But please feel free to stop me, let's engage in a dialogue about what's important to you. If you have some questions or you want a different focus in the work, we don't have to stay with my plan. But this is what I needed to do to organize and get myself ready for today. So let's start with the screen sharing. I picked this design because sometimes this is what I think the mind of my clients look like. You know, it's a jumble of diagrams and symbols and meanings. And part of our job as a psychotherapist, even as a counselor or a coach, is to help them make sense out of this internal jumble. But let's look at life scripts, all right? We're going to look at it from several different perspectives. First is that life scripts are based on physiological survival reactions. Look at the startle response in this baby. What do you see happening in this baby's body when they're startled? You've got an angry mother, or you've got a father and a mother who are arguing with each other, or there's something going wrong. The first and basic way of dealing with distress and trauma is at a physiological level. And I think that all script patterns that are established have a physiological basis to it. The earlier that happens, the much more likely the script is going to be physiological. Second, the more traumatic it is, meaning the more emotionally overwhelming the situation is, even if it's a much later age, it's going to be physiological. Right? Now, this is going to become important when we start talking about how to do treatment, because not much of the transactional analysis literature has ever paid serious attention to doing body work. We have over the years, there have been articles in that. There have been some little booklets done on integrating things like bioenergetics with TA. And yet Berne said, script begins with mother's milk. What he meant is at the age of infancy, at a time of nursing, the script begins, but there is no cognition. And affect is very diffuse, but the baby has a body reaction. Second, scripts are formed from implicit experiential conclusions. Right? Explicit experiential conclusions. So this little boy here, just look at him. If he's put in the corner and has this punishment over and over again, what kinds of conclusions is he making? Right? This is not decisional. We're talking about something that is pre-decisional and maybe too small to constitute making a decision. But it happens over and over and over. One of my clients was a very self-depreciating woman. Often I would make a comment about, oh, I'm not important. Or I would come into the waiting room half a minute late and she'd say, oh, that's okay, it doesn't matter to me. She would do all kinds of self-diminishing things. And one day in the therapy, I said to her, when did you decide that you weren't important? She looked at me and said, I never decided that. That's reality. She said, I grew up in a family. I had 5 older brothers, and then there was me. Those 5 brothers were my father's football team. He loved playing football with them. And then there was me. And I just had to help mom in the kitchen. I was not important. Why, that's reality. And that's what I think of with implicit experiential conclusions. They represent that person's reality that they grew up with, that over and over and over again, usually in terms of little neglect after little neglect, or little criticism after little criticism, that shape the child's sense of reality. Now, this is going to be important later in the therapy to distinguish between one script is at a physiological level and when it's based on implicit experiential conclusions. Which leads us to the next level, explicit decisions. These are times when the child, if you notice how much older he is now, he's sitting there, he can think, he now has moved beyond very primary function to concrete and beginning of logic, and he can put ideas together and he makes decisions. Now, so here you have a kid who's probably needs a grown-up to be sitting helping him with his homework. And he sits there and he's lost and he's lost and then lost. And he finally says to himself, I'm stupid. He makes that decision based on probably what the parents and the school does. Right? But decisional can happen, right? Like my client who did not do well in any job. He had lost several jobs. He'd go into a job for a while. He'd go through the training program, then he'd quit. He'd go through another job, then training program, and then he'd quit. And finally, in therapy, I got him to think about what happened to him early in his life. And he remembered being 12 years old, coming home from school, all excited about doing a big science project. But he couldn't do it alone. He needed his father to help him put it together. And he went to his father, and his father was sitting there reading the newspaper. He said, don't bother me. I'm not interested in that stuff. So the kid didn't do the science project, got in trouble with the teacher because he didn't come in with his project. And he remembered explicitly making the decision, I give up. I'm not going to try. And that changed the whole nature of our therapy, about helping him realize that he had made that decision. Therefore, he had the power to make a redecision. And this approach to therapy is pretty well documented in Goulden and Goulden's book, Redecisional Therapy, or in my book, Integrative Psychotherapy in Action, where we're describing a type of therapy that takes the person back to the moment of the actual decision making and fosters the environment to make a redecision. So we got script in the body, script by implicit conclusions, which is the person's sense of reality, script by explicit decisions, and now script by introjection. I think Berne in TA and psychotherapy was trying to get to this concept. And yet by the time he wrote, what do you say after you say hello? I think he lost the importance of how much of our script is as a result of introjections. And I call it self-stabilizing interjections, because when there is conflict and strife between the parent and the child, what you have then is a destabilization emotionally. So in order to stabilize themselves, they take in the attitudes, the feelings, the behavior, even the physiological response of the parent, and they make it part of themselves. Right? Interjection is different than learning, because learning has the capacity to take something apart and then put it back together. Interjection is an unconscious, self-stabilizing identification with some element of the personality of the other person that occurs in the absence of a need-fulfilling relationship. So when the child's needs are consistently not met in the relationship, it's like it creates a vacuum. I don't know how to spell it, but I can give you the sound of interjection. It's, that's the sucking sound of something like a vacuum. And the child takes on the thoughts, feelings, behaviors, attitude of the parent. It's different than learning. It's different than a non-protective identification where the child learns, they imitate, and over time they can let go of that imitation. This is a substitute that happens in the presence of difficult relationship. So you got script that is living out our parents' story or teachers. We have script based on decision. We have script based on implicit experiential conclusion and physiological survival reaction. Scripts are formed under stress at any developmental age. Now, I know a lot of TA therapists have found a passage in Berne's books where he talked about script is formed by the time age 7. I think he's right. I think he's talking about implicit conclusions happen long before 7. He's talking about physiological survival reactions long before 7, even interjection. Right. But they can be, I think they can be formed at any developmental age. I had a 55-year-old woman in therapy who came to therapy because she was having an anxiety attack. She had met a man who wanted to marry her. And she had quite loved this man. As long as he was in another city and they went back and forth, she was fine to see him once every 6 weeks or so. But the fact that he was giving up his job to come live with her and marry her, she was having a panic attack. Well, we went through her relationships with men. She was a workaholic professor at the university. She had had no relationships other than this man. But I couldn't find any script belief that inhibit her. We talked about her childhood. She had what seemed to me like a wonderful family life. I could find nothing as to why she would be so panicky about getting married. And I had sort of given up trying to solve this problem with her. When one day she said, well, I'm never going to let myself do that again. And I said, again? And it turned out that she had never told me the story that she had been married briefly for 2 years in her 20s. She had quit university to get married. She and her husband were planning to have a baby. She had had a difficult time getting pregnant and she was ovulating. So she called him at his job. She said, come on home now, I'm ovulating. We're going to make a baby. And he was rushing home. And instead of stopping at the crossing gate when it came down for the train, he went around the crossing gate and was killed. And she went into a severe depression. Unbeknownst to me, she had been hospitalized for 18 months with her severe depression. She was so drugged that she had forgotten about her time in the hospital. Came out of the hospital, went back to university, threw herself into being a workaholic, and had totally forgotten about that experience. But here she was, she made a decision at age 28 that she was never going to be in a painfully inducing relationship again. So she would be a workaholic instead. Right? So there's an example of the kind of a script decision that's made both physiologically and intellectually in life. Right? So I think it's important that we look beyond Berne's comment that the script is formed by age 7. Yes, he's right, but there's also incidences later in life where script is formed. What is a script? The scripts inhibit spontaneity and limit flexibility in problem solving, in health maintenance, and in relationship to people. So I'm asking myself when I sit there with a client, is there difficulty in relationships with people? Are they having difficulty maintaining good health? Do they have difficulty in problem solving? Give you another example of that. I'm doing a workshop and one of the people in the workshop says, I'm having a terrible time writing my TA exam for my clinical certification. I said, what happened? She said, oh, I promised myself every day I'm going to sit down and write it. But I come home and I sit down at my desk and immediately I see the mail there that I haven't even opened for several days. Then I realize something has to be cleaned. And then I get up and I jump around. She said, and every day I go through this same thing. And I've been doing this for over a year and it's agonizing. And I said, come on, let's go back and sit at that same desk. But just imagine yourself in high school. And she began to shake and told me the story of how she would come home from school with homework to do that she never did because she had to get her drunken mother up off the floor onto the sofa. She had to clean up the alcohol mess. She had to cook the meal. She had to get her mother to bed that night. How she had all the family responsibilities. And what she was doing now, 25 years later, was reliving that experience. But what I saw was that she couldn't do the problem solving. She couldn't sit down and answer those questions because she was flooded with emotional memory. What I did with her is I said, all right, what's the first question you have to answer? Let's turn on a tape recorder. She and I talked about it. I said, now go write it. Now, what's the next question? We talked about it together. I said, go now take this tape recording and write it down. She finished that exam in no time because she had somebody there helping her solve that problem, right? So I'm always looking at, are they have difficulty solving problems in their life, financially, where to live, what to do, difficulties with health maintenance or relationship with people. I'm thinking in terms of script. Life scripts are often developed by infants, young children, adolescents, and even adults as a mean of coping with disruptions in significant dependent relationships. Relationships that repeatedly failed to satisfy crucial developmentally based needs. So I think of script always as having a disruption for the person in significant dependent relationship. And that's important because it brings us back eventually to a relational focus in our psychotherapy. Life scripts are unconscious systems of psychological organization unconscious systems of psychological organization that serve to self-regulate the person's emotions and physiological response. Scripts become a very important crutch for people. Scripts are expressed through physiological discomforts, escalations or minimizations of affect, and the transferences that occur in everyday life. Right? For example, many people's body ailments are directly related to an expression of the script, particularly things like chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, and a lot of issues around immune system deficiencies. We know that those are things that can significantly change with a serious in-depth psychotherapy. Right? Another way scripts are expressed are with the escalations or minimizations of affect. I often think when I'm doing supervision to help the young trainees know that when an emotion exceeds the current context, it is almost always an escalation of some emotional memory of a previous event. And then we have the transferences that occur in everyday life. These are not just the transference that we think of in a classical sense of transference between client and therapist. It's the dramas that get played out in the workplace, it's with the neighbors, with other family members. Right? Those are the stories being enacted, often unconscious to the person. But that is where the script is often most in display. The unconscious relational patterns that form a life script influence the reactions and expectations that define for us the kind of world we live in, the people we are, and the quality of interpersonal relationships we'll have with others. So scripts are a complex set, and this is an elaborate definition, so I'll take time going through it. Scripts are a complex set of unconscious relational patterns based on physiological survival reactions, implicit experiential conclusions, explicit decisions, and or self-regulating interjections made under stress at any developmental age that inhibit spontaneity and limit flexibility in problem solving, health maintenance, and in relationship with people. And that's the definition of script for which ITAA awarded me the Eric Berne Memorial Award. So I'm going to stop screen sharing for a while and come back to all of you and have some time now to engage in some discussion here about what's stimulated in your thoughts as I share some of these ideas about script.
Richard, as you were speaking, I kept on thinking of the work of Gabriel Mate, who is a medical doctor who speaks and writes now entirely about illnesses being as a result of what he doesn't call it scripts, but a result of childhood trauma. And I remember him saying in an interview that when a child has to choose between authenticity and attachment, the child will always choose attachment.
Yes.
And yeah, so, and he's, you know, his emphasis on the impact of physically on the human being. And as a doctor, he's doing the work actually of the psychotherapist because he firmly believes it all lies there.
If I'm correct, he came to a TA conference many, many years ago.
Because he does sound like
if it's the same, if it's the same Gabor that I remember meeting, who was also a physician.
Possible, yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Am I understanding that scripts don't necessarily develop in, is your understanding that not everyone has a script? it's only if you've been through particular experiences you develop one, or?
Well, that now depends on what you mean by script. All right. You take somebody like Vanita English, who, by the way, just died very recently at 105. She believed that everybody had a script. I think what she described as script is what I would call frame of reference. All right. Frame of reference is based on all the things that you've experienced, what you've learned. The fact that you're speaking English to me with your South African accent rather than with my North American accent, the kind of foods you gravitate to, how you go about solving problems, all of that is part of the cultural context in which you grew up in. We can't escape that. We're all part of that culture. And then that culture gets smaller and smaller. You're part of your family culture. Is that script? Probably not. That's frame of reference. And as Vanita said, get into it, embrace it, make it work for you. I think this is the same idea that comes across in some of Bill Cornell's writings. But I've taken Berne's original idea that script represents that which is dysfunctional, that inhibits spontaneity and flexibility in problem solving, in health maintenance, and relationship with people. So I'm looking at those three dimensions of a person's life as I'm thinking about script.
So the reality is those are also part of living, is to have problems and relational challenges and health issues. Is it when it becomes an ongoing pattern that there's no resolution to? Is that when you would say yes?
Yeah, that's a nice little colloquial way of describing it.
Yeah.
It's not that we're going to be problem free. It's how do we manage it when we have the problem?
And
Diane talked before about having her knee surgery, and I said, the secret is a lot of exercise afterward. I have a friend who went to the same surgeon I did, who hates him. She thinks he's an awful surgeon. He's butchered her. And she's still limping around 3 years later. I went to the same surgeon. I'm fine. But I walked up and down the stairs in my building with tears running down my cheek in pain as I exercised. She didn't do the exercise. And now she's enraged at her physician, but she didn't do the work.
Yes.
All right. So it's how we manage the situation.
And realizing there are some fairly difficult, intractable situations people are in. So sometimes, very hectic problem solving is required.
That's right. And so what I'm always asking myself too is, what kind of stress was the person under? Physiologically, emotionally, even intellectually.
Thank you.
Yeah, Diane?
I'm particularly interested in the self-stabilizing interject. I love your, how I also talk sometimes about how we swallow people whole, or swallow aspects of people whole. How would you make a difference between that as an aspect of script and that interject as an aspect of parent ego state?
Well, boy, you've given me several different directions to go. First of all, we'd have to define what do we mean by parent ego state, which is all over the place in the whole body of TA literature. But if you go back to Berne's original definition, he is talking about interjection.
Yeah.
It is the unconscious self-protective identification with some element in the personality of the parent. And I've added that occurs in the absence of a need fulfilling relationship. So if you're my mama and you're out of tune with me, my needs aren't getting met, I'm going to deal with that vacuum in our relationship by trying to take you inside. And now I'm more stable. Right? Which brings me to another thing. We have to define what is self-stabilization. Because I think this is particularly important, whether you're working in coaching or doing psychotherapy. I think of 4 primary parental functions that I have just, later I'll show you a book that has just come out where I define them in detail. But these are parental functions that children need the parents to do. First is parental stabilization. This occurs when the baby wakes up, let's say at 2 o'clock in the morning, she's hungry, she starts crying and escalating her cry to wake the parents up so they come and feed her. And what does mom have to do? First of all, she can't just put this crying baby on the breast. She has to soothe her down, calm her down so she can suck, right? Because if she doesn't calm her down, you don't get the sucking reflex, right? That's mother's stabilizing function. The second parental function is regulation. Okay? This is anticipating the problem. This is the mother who knows that her dinner is going to be later than usual. The kid is starting to fuss, maybe becoming a little hypoglycemic. So she makes some carrots and celery and sits the kid down with a little cream cheese and celery and say, here, have a little snack because dinner is going to be a little late. She's anticipating the problem and she does something ahead of time. That's external or parental regulation. Slightly different than stabilization. Stabilization is soothing after the problem. Regulation is doing something before the problem escalates. Third is parental reparation. Right? Little girl has a new pair of roller skates. She's out roller skating. She falls. She cuts her knee. Father comes out and said, "Oh, that's awful. Look at that blood. Now we're going to go in the house and we're going to wash it off. But I'm warning you, the soap and water is going to burn. Oh, can you handle it? Okay, we're going to wash it off. Now we're going to put some antibiotic cream on it. And importantly, we're going to get a great big bandage. So you can go out and show your friends the bandage you have." Right? So what's he doing? He's repairing. He's engaging in parental reparation. The fourth is enhancement. He goes back outside with her and says, "Okay, now let's see where you fell. Oh, you did your roller skate over that crack in the sidewalk. Now, let's see if we can roller skate the other direction. Come on, we're going to do it together. I'll run alongside of you and get you started. Come on, you can do it. Okay, now come back. See, you've mastered it. Now go to where the crack is. Stop. Step over the crack. Okay, you can do it. Keep going. You can do it." That's an enhancement. Okay? So those are 4 important functions in parenting. Now, what happens when that child needs that parental stabilization and they don't get it? They prematurely do it unto themselves. and they learn ways of self-stabilizing. So the child who is lonely, going to bed, scared of the dark, she learns to sit there and go like that until she puts herself to sleep. Or they learn to self-regulate. They do things before there's an attack, or before there is a disappointment, before there is something going wrong. As one of my clients said, I could tell by the way he came up the front stairs to the house if my father was intoxicated or not. And as soon as I heard his foot on the stairs, I went in my room and closed the door and pretended to be doing my homework. That's a self-regulation. She's anticipating the problem and protecting herself from it ahead of time. Right? Self-reparation. A lot of people engage in a great deal of self-regulation and reparation. I have a client who periodically gets in arguments driving his car, and he will pick fights with other drivers on the street, and then he gets scared and he goes home and he masturbates. I think his masturbation is not so much a perversion, is an attempt that it's something he learned as a little boy to probably stabilize or regulate himself. Right? And then we have self-enhancement. When a parent doesn't engage in self-enhancement, or if they exaggerate and tell a child how much better they are than they really are, the child learns to exaggerate their own self-importance. So you've got stabilization, regulation, reparation, and enhancement. Those are important parental functions that when they don't occur, the child takes on for themselves. And those are all part of the dynamics of script. Now, Diane, there's a very long answer to your short question. Did I cover your concern?
You covered, thank you, and a lot more.
Yeah. And so what I'm always looking for is has my client consistently engaged in one of those functions, one of those parental functions as a self function prematurely. Now, children have to learn to have those self functions. We don't let them go to kindergarten if they're still biting other kids or pulling hair or spitting on other kids. We don't allow them in kindergarten. They have to learn how to get along and do some self-stabilization, some self-regulation. But I'm concerned when it's learned much too young. Okay.
And
So
I
what I did,
asked,
yeah. Hi,
what,
Denise.
in these parental functions, what happens in a situation where there's an absent parent? Can one parent sufficiently fulfill these functions for a child? Or is this that child?
Yes, but it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. One of my daughters has intentionally chosen to have a child from an anonymous donor, and a child is now 8 years old, but my daughter is exhausted all the time. And I always say to myself, well, who does the child turn to when there's a conflict with mother? Right? So at 8 o'clock last night, My granddaughter was bored, so she got on the phone with me. So we FaceTimed for half an hour because she was bored because her mother was busy doing something. But you know, I think that's why we are not born hermaphrodites. I think it takes at least two people to raise a child. Hillary Clinton used to say it takes a whole village to raise a child. You know, I think there's going to be parental failures. That's just inevitable. There's going to be those misattunements. There's going to be those times when mother doesn't stabilize or father doesn't repair, and they're forced to do it themselves.
Can I ask one more question as well? You spoke of introjection happening when there's a strained relationship. Is there introjection without a strain, in the sense I just identify a little boy maybe really identifying with his father and just thinking I just want to be like him?
Of course. That's the natural process growing up. But because the identification is often done with some awareness.
Okay.
So
Oh,
I'm
it's a
going to
choice.
be like daddy when I'm 5 and 6 years old, because
Okay.
daddy is the coolest guy in the world. But then I discovered the fireman down the street, and I like going to the fire station. And now I want to get one of those fireman's hats for myself, because now I'm 7 and 8. And by the time I'm 9 or 10, I want to be a spaceman, because going to space is fabulous. And by the time I'm 14 or 15, maybe I think I'll be an engineer when I get older. But then I've had a very successful medical experience, and now I want to be a doctor. Yeah, that's all part of growing up and identifying, and that's how we learn. We learn by identifying and imitating.
So you're speaking more of a coping as opposed to a choice. It's just
That's right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. All right. Interjection occurs when there is an absence of need fulfilling relationship. And it's in the purpose of filling up that vacuum. So if, you know, you're my daughter and you and I don't really connect, there's going to be a vacuum there. And how do you manage that vacuum? By taking the father into your head as a constant kind of companion. He may be critical, always telling you that you're no good, you're nothing, but at least there is that companionship. Now, the way I describe it is more mechanistic and more logical and more conscious than it ever really is. This is a non-conscious but self-stabilizing process. Now, part of our task as therapists is to help people become conscious of it.
Yes, I was just looking at one of your slides. You say these scripts occur with disruptions in significant dependent relationships. But I would imagine that you could quite easily form a script after any kind of emotionally traumatic situation, like being in a car accident or something like that, having somebody close to you dying as a young child. You know, you could come up with, well, I'm not going to, you make all sorts of scripts about your choice of car or something.
You have a car accident. There's two kids in the backseat of the car, and they both get broken legs, right? They go into the hospital, and one parent comes in and says, comforts the child, says, you know, has a real engaging conversation with them, is there for them. And the other parent comes in and criticizes the child for not wearing the seatbelt properly, or for sitting with his legs up against the door, and the child gets criticized and put down for it. Right? Child A probably doesn't form a script. He just has a bad experience, and someone helps him through it. Child B has the insult added to the injury, and that is around the issues around which script happens. One incident probably doesn't create the script, but if that story of being criticized for being hurt has happened hundreds of other ways, more subtle, that begins the basis of the script. All right, shall we go back to the screen and talk about treatment? Let's go right back here. Let's talk about all the different approaches to psychotherapy, right? Body therapy, right? If the scripts have a physiological survival reaction, and I suspect they all do, at least to some degree, and the earlier it happens, or the more traumatic the event, the more likely it's going to be in the body, then we need to integrate into our work doing body work, whether it's helping people learn to breathe differently, having them get up and move in our therapy sessions rather than just sitting still, whether we incorporate dance or yoga, or that we do massage work. I think we need to be focusing on the body much more, particularly when you're dealing with very young issues. I was originally started by training as an osteopath, so that over the years, I've done a lot of hands-on body work, deep muscle massage, usually around neck and upper back areas. But also when I've worked with people who've been sexually abused, holding them in a secure way and allowing them to kick and use their legs in powerful ways to fight back, right? So you've got to think physiologically when we're working. And I think this is one of the reasons why we must work at a physiological level with some clients at some phase in the therapy to deal at the physiological level of the script. Then we come to implicit experiential conclusions. And I remember having quite an argument with Mary Goulding about when redecisional therapy doesn't work. Because I think it does not work when you're dealing with implicit experiential conclusions. I wrote a whole book on redecisional therapy called Integrated Psychotherapy in Action, but it's not appropriate for these kinds of experiential conclusions because these are based on event after event after event. What is the psychotherapy? This is where an ongoing, consistent relational psychotherapy is absolutely essential, where the therapist's consistency, dependability, and reliability is the therapy. It's not the content so much of what we deal with, but it is how we are in relationship with the person time after time after time. Right? Their script is like the crustaceans in a cave, the stalagmites that get formed by drop after drop after drop. And these are usually kids who've had little neglect after little neglect after little neglect. But it begins to calcify. They've had little criticism after criticism, punishment after punishment. And what they need then is our tenderness, our kindness, our respect, our patience. the who we are in the psychotherapy becomes more important in the treatment process than any of the methods or any of the content that we talk about. When you come to explicit decisions, now we're in the realm of redecisional therapy. This is the realm where some of our Gestalt techniques are very effective, using an empty chair or two-chair technique. This is where taking the person back into the original scene, helping them re-experience that scene, what they decided. And I wrote an article years ago called Disconnecting the Rubber Band, which is slightly different than the way the Gouldings do redecision. They direct the person, all right, you made that decision, now make a redecision. In Disconnecting the Rubber Band, what I talked about is helping the person look into the future. Okay, you're now 12 years old. You made that decision that I'm never going to be a success. How did you live that out when you were 18? And how did you live that out when you were 30? And how did you live it out at 45? That becomes the impetus then for making a redecision. And people can make redecisions that will fundamentally change their life. Fourth level of treatment is psychotherapy of the parent ego state. This is where I have the person often sit like their parent, engage in experiencing, if they can, what it's like to be in the parent's body. And then I interview that parent. But this is different than John McNeil's parent interview. John McNeil told me that he wrote that article based on a previous article I had written called 6 Stages of Treatment. And he was looking for a short 15 or 20-minute way to end the therapy so that people would have compassion for their parent. Well, some of the parents that I have dealt with were abusive. They were rapers, they were physical beaters, they were neglectful. And so finding compassion for them is not as important as for the child to get them out of their head. And so what we do is engage in a real dialogue with that parent in their head, doing psychotherapy for that parent. Now, this is not a fast process. It usually takes me an hour or 2 hours to do if I'm doing it in a workshop, and I realize then I'm never complete. Or with some of my clients, I've done it for 15 minutes in each session, week after week for a year and a half or 2. Right? If you want to know more about it, in this book, Relational Patterns, Therapeutic Presence, chapter 16 and 17 go into depth about the treatment of the parent ego state. I think there is also a chapter in the Life Scripts book. I've got an embarrassment of riches. I've written so much now, I don't remember what I wrote in what book. But it's out there somewhere. But I know it is in here in chapter 16 and 17.
Oh, Richard?
Yeah.
May I ask? I just wanted to ask you if you could speak a little bit more about that. How do you get that parent out of his head? When you do that, how does that happen?
Okay. First of all, it's not a treatment approach that I take lightly. because first of all, I don't want to take them out of the person's head until we have a relationship. Least I create an orphan. Right? Remember that blood is thicker than therapy. You say in South Africa, blood's thicker than water. Well, change it. Blood is thicker than therapy. All right. So that I want to build the quality of relationship with that person so that they really experience that I'm with them and for them, that I'm there on their side. Right. I think that's necessary first. The second is I usually wait until there is some internal disturbance. So I have that parent ego state is affected in some way that makes it a bit more ripe, ready to do. And then I have them often sit in a different chair. Usually I'll pull up a more like a hard chair and say, all right, come on, sit just like your mother sat. Okay, where would she put her handbag? Knowing that that generation, she always carried her purse everywhere. You know, all right, where would you put your handbag? How would you sit there? Now put the expression on your face that your mother would have if she was coming to my office. And then I usually begin with a very mundane conversation about who are you and where you're from? And then, 10 minutes into that, well, will you help me? Because, here's your son and he's troubled by some things and I need your help. And I solicit them in a partnership. But then I very quickly start saying, but before we talk about your son, where did you grow up? What was life like for you? And I get them telling me their lifelong story about their childhood, the events that happened in their life. I'm looking for the script decisions. I'm looking for their physiological survival reactions. I'm looking for their kind of conclusions and helping them talk about that. Usually I'm bringing them back to the point of their marriage, the marriage that my client lived in the middle of. Right? And start getting the parent to tell their story. Usually I know a lot about what the parent did or did not do with the child. So eventually, if we're really working warmed up together, I get them to start talking about that event. And if I can, get them to start taking responsibility for that event. Right? Ideally, I talk about ideally, which makes this more theoretical than practical. I want them to be able to take responsibility, to acknowledge what they have done, perhaps to apologize for what they've done, perhaps to give the child permission to do something differently, to make some change in the relationship. Right? And then what I want to do afterward is have the person go back and sit in the child's position and respond back to the parent of what it's like to have heard them take responsibility. That is often very relieving, as some people have said to me, and I've heard the same thing several times, it's like taking a huge load off their shoulders. Or one guy said it felt like I was carrying 50 kilos on my back in a backpack and now it's gone. Does that make sense to you? Yeah.
Yes, that's great.
In the
Thank you.
book, Beyond Empathy, there's a couple of good case examples of that kind of work. Or in the book, The Art and Science of Relationship, the final chapter is a long version of working with both the child and the person and the parent ego state. But it is doing therapy with the interjection, just as though they were my actual client. Yeah.
Richard?
Yeah.
I have a question related to the longer term relationally focused therapy. What if a client is invested in staying sick because that was the only way that they could actually make contact with their early caregiver, and they don't want to actually give that up? And so the more you remain in contact with them and relational with them, the more scary the therapy actually becomes. And, you know, they start then reenacting what they did with their parents, so that you end up as the therapist being in the position of the parent.
You gave me a story. What's your question?
The question is, you know, how would one deal with that from a relational point of view?
Well, one of the things is, if you can get enough cognition from the person, I would lay out the story just the way you told me and said, what do you think about it? Is this what you think is going on between us? And I would deal with it quite cognitively, maybe slightly confrontative from the way you described it. But there's another theoretical point of view. If they are enacting it with you, they're trying to resolve it in some way. And then I would say to myself, what am I doing that isn't working here? What have I got to do to change my way of relating to this person's repeated trauma?
Right. Yeah.
I would probably also start working much more in the here and now relationship between us. For example, you know, my client might be there crying and telling me the same story for the 7th time. All right.
Yeah.
And then what I might do is say, you know, let's talk about you and me. You've told me this story now several other times. How do you experience my listening? And what happens between us when you're telling me that story? Now, you've had to tell me this story several times. What am I not doing that repetition becomes so important here? So I bring it right back into not just the relationship originally in their life, but what's happening between us in the here and now. And that's part of what we mean when we talk about this whole relational focus, the whole turn in psychotherapy away from a cognitive behavioral approach to relational. It's working both in the relationship that's between us right now in the room and the relationships that form the person's personality in those early years of their life. So we're not just dealing with history, we're dealing with what's happening, and we're moving back and forth between the two. Do you have a client like that now?
Yeah, I do.
Well, another question then is, what would her life be like if she wasn't sitting there complaining to you about the same story week after week?
She'd be doing it with everybody else, which is what she does anyway, and can get no one to actually be with her or listen to her.
So you are providing something.
Yeah, I'm a sounding board.
Maybe that's the therapy. You know, yeah, maybe it's more your need to change than hers.
Definitely.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, if you think of it, I don't want to be pessimistic, but there are some clients who pay the rent.
He doesn't even pay the rent.
but meaning that they are so stuck that they don't change. But they need us. They need you to be their sounding board. And I would suspect that if she doesn't have you, her life would be much poorer shape.
Mm.
You know, and it's also amazing sometimes what we do. I had a Puerto Rican American woman come to therapy, slightly overweight. Not, I wouldn't say she's fat, but she was sort of no longer looked like she took good care of herself. And messy hair, but came into therapy and said she wanted to work on her feelings and proceeded to tell me about the movies. And every week she would tell me about some other cinema. Turned out she went to the movies 6-7 days a week. So week after week, she told me about what was at the cinema. Then she would tell me about the actors. She'd tell me about the plot. She knew all about all the love life of everybody in Hollywood. And she talked like that to me every week from September until May. And I could not get any therapy in there. Always she talked about movies. And anytime I would talk about therapy, and I was trying a very cognitive approach because that seemed to be the only way to reach her, it would remind her of some plot in some movie. So then I went away for the summer. She was scheduled to come back in September. She walked in the door. I was absolutely amazed. She had lost several kilos. She was cleanly and nicely dressed in new clothing and had a short, beautiful looking haircut. And I said to Maria, what's happened to you? And she said, well, you know, you went away for the summer and I decided I didn't have you to talk to anymore. And, you know, the way you treated me, I knew I wasn't crazy. And she said, so I went home and I broke up with my girlfriend. She said, I never told you I was in a lesbian relationship, but you know, that didn't work for me. So I got rid of her. I went in that same week and quit my job. I went on a diet. I decided I'm going to change my appearance. And she said, so here I am. It's been a great summer. I really changed my life. I said, oh, that's great. Now we can really get somewhere in the therapy. She said, this is somewhere. This is why I came. This is my last session. What did I do? I don't know what I did. Yeah. Same reason when I'm writing, I'm only writing about my successes because I don't know how to write about my failures. You know, because I don't know what I did. The therapy didn't work. But my guess, Sharon, is you're doing something for this woman. What do you think?
Clearly I am, but yeah, I hear you.
Have you asked her?
The last time I saw her, I did ask her and she said, I don't know.
Come back again. Let's think about it tomorrow. You know, I said, come on, let's talk about this some more. What would happen to you if I stopped doing the therapy? If you couldn't come every week and tell me these stories, what would happen? I have a guess that just listening to you, I mean, you're listening to her, you're being with her, is stabilizing in some way.
Mm.
But you made me think of the Maria story because I felt so helpless. I talked about that to colleagues and in my supervision group, and everybody had some advice, but what I did is I listened to her tell me about movies, waiting for what I thought would be my turn to be therapeutic. And the therapy was in listening to her without thinking she was crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Do you folks need a stretch? You need to get up and have a little tea and pee and okay. What do you need? 5 minutes, 10 minutes? What is 5 minutes enough?
I think 5 minutes
Okay.
is good.
see you right at 1:30 then. That'll give us 7 minutes. Yeah. Well, we still have a few more people here. Anybody want to say anything while we're waiting for the few stragglers?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, who's that?
Kirsty.
Christy? Yeah.
I'm wondering how much of this work can be done by oneself. I'm thinking of the body work, and I'm thinking of that consistency, the dependability of the therapist. I'm wondering if we can offer that to ourselves to some extent, and how much progress we could actually make that way.
Well, people can certainly do a lot of changes in their life. There's lots of evidence that some people have done some profound healing by themselves. But I think since most of the problems we deal with are relational, what they need is a healing relationship. Freud once was asked about his self-analysis. He had never had anybody analyze him, but he analyzed himself. And he said, oh, it was a very good experience. The only problem was in the countertransference. Meaning we're blind to ourselves. We don't know our own blind spots. Certainly that's what the whole market of self-help books is about. Every once in a while people say to me, Richard, why don't you write a self-help book? I don't want to do that because I don't particularly have a lot of stock in it. And yet I know some people have had those moments of epiphany where they just totally changed their life. Yeah.
It seems to be quite a movement at the moment of self-healing, and I just wondered how much work we can really do with that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, you know this guy? All right. Eric Berne used the term script to describe unconscious relational patterns, all right? The patterns that we're talking about, physiological survival reactions, implicit experiential conclusions, explicit decisions, self-regulating interjections, all right? He just took all of that together and he called it script. And he defined script as an extensive unconscious life plan that reflects the adaptations of infantile reactions and experiences. Now, when he wrote that, he was particularly focused on what happens between mother and baby in that first couple of years of life. And this was Berne's real focus when he was at the hospital. People probably don't realize that most of his patients were borderline clients. And so he was very much aware of what happens in those first few years of life in terms of mother-baby interaction. In 1972, though, Berne referred to script as a life plan based on decisions made in childhood, reinforced by parents, justified by subsequent events, and culminating in the chosen alternative. Now, interestingly, what is missing from here is the physiological nature of it. The work that is emphasized in Stephen Porges's focus on the nervous system, particularly the vagal nerve that runs from the brain down to the digestive organs, to the body work of Pat Ogden or Peter Levine, all of whom are working at a body level of dealing with script. And here he's talking about decisions. I don't think he's taking into account those minute events that happen over and over again that form conclusions about life. I think if he were alive today and we had this conversation, my guess is that he would be agreeing with me. I first heard the term script in a workshop with Fritz Perls before I became a transactional analyst, who described them as self-confirming repetitive conclusions and patterns that he called a life script. It was composed of both what he called the early scene and the resulting life plan. The other person who wrote about script without using that term is John Bowlby, writing about unconscious relational patterns. And Bowlby described the biological imperative of prolonged physical and affective bonding in the creation of the visceral core from which all experience of self with others emerged. So he saw script as an attachment pattern, and that is formed very early in life. Bowlby referred to these patterns as internal working models that are generalized from past experiences. And I think it's Bowlby's theory provides an understanding of how an infant or young child's physiological survival reactions and implicit experiential conclusions may form what he called internal working models, or the antecedents of an unconscious life script. So I think to thoroughly change a life script is necessary to provide the quality of relationship that helps the client to integrate their affect, physiologically, and cognition, so that behavior is by choice in the current context and not stimulated by compulsion, fear, or conditioning. Right? And let me just go through this again, because I think this is the core of what I consider the work. I think to thoroughly change the script, it's necessary to provide that quality relationship that integrates physiology, affect, and cognition, so that behavior is by choice in the current context and not stimulated by fear or conditioning. And this is what we mean by internal integration. And how do we do that? In psychotherapy, we work at physiologically, affectively, behaviorally, and cognitively. And in a few minutes, I'm going to give you a cognitive tool for working with scripts. All of these various writers, Berne, Finite English, Claude Steiner, Pete Stuntz, Williams, Gouldings, have all described script as being formed by parental injunctions and child's acquiescence to the parent's messages. Their ideas, however, vary about how injunctions are communicated, the critical developmental periods when the child is most susceptible to such messages, and the psychological lethalness of both injunctions and resulting compliance. But basically, they see script as injunctive messages. Each of these theorists view script as an interaction of injunctions, counter-injunctions, and compliance. Therapy for these script dynamics is described by these authors as consisting of explanation, illustration, confirmation, and interpretation. Steiner put particular emphasis on the coercive power of parents' overt ulterior messages to lethally shape a child's life. And yet I have had many clients over the years who have not had lethal, corrosive messages. Bob and Mary Goulding describe a list of injunctions that form as a basis for making child script decisions. But what about those clients who may not have had those lethal injunctions? They just simply have been neglected. And John McNeil has written a lot about elaborating on Goulding's ideas. In fact, he's going to be doing a workshop very soon for ITAA, if any of you were interested, about his new ideas on injunctions. All of these people, though, has examples of script decisions or examples of explicit memories, wherein a scene from childhood is consciously remembered, a corresponding parental injunction is identified, and the child's original decision can change. But when memories and script decisions are explicit, they may be responsive to a redecision therapy. And several examples are in this book by Gouldings or in this book that I did. Allen and Allen, in their award-winning article, suggests that the therapist's permission to live differently than the parental injunctions dictate an important element in altering the effects of a life script. So they see permission as the important element of providing new experiences because it comes from an involved other person who is invested in the client's welfare. So these things that I've just run through are all the various perspectives in the TA literature. Now, let's come to what Karen asked me to focus on in this workshop, is the script system. In a 1980 article, I identified the behavioral, interpsychic, and physiological dimensions that we called script cure, and established a theoretical basis for the script system, which you may know under the title of racket system that Marilyn Zeltzman and I got the award for. My goodness, this date is not correct. 2980 is beyond my capacity. The script system provides a model of how life script is lived out in current life. So what we've been talking about so far is like, if you had a tree and you're talking about the roots and how that trunk grows and how the branches spread out, what formed the script and the branches and how it affects people's life. Now what we're going to do is take a cross section and we're going to look at how is script lived out in current life in the person's day-to-day behavior, in interpersonal relationships, in their fantasy, through internal physiological sensations, and with specific memory. And that's what the script system addresses. So we're looking at how is the script operational in life today as core beliefs about self, others, and the quality of life. So we begin with these three areas of beliefs. Then we go on how the script is composed of internal experiences, imaginations, and conceptualizations that are augmented by generalizations and elaborations that construct a reality of ourselves, others, and the quality of life. A life script leads us to be afraid of or angry about what may never occur, or to be deeply hurt by our anticipations, or to suffer unnecessarily in current relationships because of self-reinforcing nature of script beliefs. So let's take a look at how the script system is laid out. All right. We're going to look at the various parts of the script system. And this is a chart that I actually have copied, and I have many photocopies of this chart that I keep in my clients' notes. And so what I'm often at the end of a session sitting down and say, what data has emerged in this session? What do I know what they believe about themselves? You know, I'm unworthy. I'm not lovable. Something's wrong with me. Those are typical beliefs about the self, or beliefs about other. People can't be trusted. People are only interested in themselves. No one's going to tell the truth. Right? Those are beliefs about others. Or beliefs about the quality of life. Life is suffering. Life is hard. Or as one of my clients said regularly in the beginning of his therapy, oh, you're born, you pay taxes, you suffer, and you die. And that was his motto. And I think that's where he was going with his life. Right? So I'm always looking at what do they believe about themselves, others, and the quality of life. Do that clients come right out and say these things to you? Sometimes. But usually they're in the parenthetical phrase, or they're how they end the story. Or my client who would come in several times and say, you won't believe me, but let me tell you about, and I noticed week after week, it started with, you won't believe me. And I realized why it seemed like the therapy was going nowhere, because that's the filter through which he presented everything. Another client would often tell me a story and end up with, so what do you expect from someone like me? Right. There was it captured in that little parenthetical comment at the end of the story, his sense of his own value. So when these beliefs are going on about self, others, the quality of life, they're going to be acted in some kind of overt behavior. The client who doesn't speak, or the client who goes on and talks about many things, or like my client Maria, who talked only about the movies because she thought if she said anything else that I would define her as crazy. Right. So that I'm always looking for what is the repetitive behavior. Or with some people, that behavior isn't so overt, it's in their physiological survival reactions. One of my clients said, I always had a stomach ache in the first 2 years of therapy before I came to your office. He said, I thought many times of not coming. I always had a stomach ache when I arrived at your office, and it was always gone by the time I left. Right? He was living out in his tummy something that he believed about himself. Or these script beliefs occur in fantasy, in dreams, in our daydreams. They may not be acted out in overt behavior, but they're there in the fantasy. Now, each of these overt behaviors, physiological reactions and fantasies, produce current events. Right? So the person who believes no one likes me may stay home from the party. So staying home from the party is their overt behavior. Right? Because they don't go to the party, they have no challenge to their belief that no one likes me. Of course, there's someone else who also believes no one likes me, but he goes to the party, but he gets intoxicated, he dances with a lampshade on his head, he makes a fool of himself, and people push him away, thereby collecting evidence to prove that no one likes me. So in either situation, what I'm looking always for, how is the overt behavior a reflection of their script beliefs? And then what kind of current events do they have that reinforce that? I had a woman in group, came to group therapy. The group had already been going for a couple of years when she entered the therapy. And it was a very interesting group in the fact that they would often get together for some of them for dinner before the group started and others to go out for coffee afterward. But after the first few weeks, she started coming later, didn't join the group ahead of time, although they invited her. She wouldn't go. She was one of the first to leave the office at the end of the group. So those were the observable behaviors: coming late, leaving early, not enjoying the social activity. And as the group went on, it became clear that she was unhappy in the group. And as the people inquired, she realized, she said that, well, she had a feeling that nobody liked her. And we listened to this for 3 or 4 weeks of nobody likes me, nobody really cares about me. And finally, in one session, I said to her, you know, I like you. She turned to me and said, but that doesn't count because you get paid for it. All right. And there's a good example of discounting the process. Right. So the group worked with her to help her realize that she was living out these old beliefs. And finally she said, okay, some of you like me, but when I was in school, and what she did is she jumped to these old memories. And she had a whole series of memories about the painful adolescence she had with her acne, with her flat chest, how the boys didn't like her, the girls didn't like her, she wasn't included. And she lived in these old memories when she couldn't get current events in the group to prove that she wasn't likable. She relied on those old childhood. So that we worked with the script system, drew it out for her. Each week came back to this. So this script system becomes a very good cognitive tool for working with script. Oh, I'm always thinking. Just a moment. I get excited about this and I start going faster and faster and I lose my voice. Underneath all of this is the repression of feelings and needs. And this is where, as a clinician, my mind is always going of what feelings and needs were repressed at the time the script beliefs were formed. Were these beliefs formed as decisions? Were they formed as conclusions? Or were they formed as parental messages? Here's an example of a client called Bobby, who I wrote about in the book, Relational Patterns, Therapeutic Presence. And his script belief was, I don't need anything from anyone. People are only interested in themselves and something will go wrong. And those were primary 3 script beliefs we worked with. How did this get manifested? I don't need anything from anyone was manifested in having no meaningful relationships in his life. Not even with his wife. What he focused on is the criticisms at work and the fact that other people showed no interest in him. And so these are the things he wanted to talk about in therapy. And often what people want to talk about in therapy is what happened in the current event. What they don't pay much attention to is how does this hurt and by people's criticism and people's lack of interest in him come around to reinforce the script belief. And part of that is he stayed out of having any meaningful relationships. Right? So he had a self-fulfilling prophecy. Another one of his beliefs that kept him out of making any meaningful relationship was people are only interested in themselves. And when he was thinking about both, I don't need anything from anyone and people are only interested in themselves, I noticed the tension in his shoulders. So his body would tense up. Right? And I think he had many, many emotional memories of his cold mother and his absent father not being there, showing any interest in him. And we went through a lot of stories about his childhood, about his loneliness, coming back around and fulfilling his people are only interested in themselves, and his conclusion, I don't need anything from anyone. And then he constantly worried. He was always worried about what would go wrong in relationships, because there were several things that had gone seriously wrong in his early childhood. And one of his beliefs constantly is something will go wrong, which stimulated his constant worry, stimulated his overt behavior of having no meaningful relationships because he knew something would go wrong, and added to the tension in his shoulders. Each of these then provided reinforcing experiences that fed these script beliefs, but also repress the feelings and needs that were present at the time of script formation. And what I did with Bobby is spend a lot of time talking about the relational needs that he had as a child. But let me pause here for a moment and come back to all of you so that we have a chance to talk together before I go on with more material. Your thoughts and reactions as I present the script system? Christy, were you going to say something? Oh, your screen lit up. Okay. Yeah, Lynn? You'll have to unmute, please.
There we go, that's better.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, you're talking about the scripts forming because of unpleasant childhood experiences. But I think sometimes if one has a very pleasant childhood experience, and I think I would fall into that, I had a very caring mother who really went out of her way to smooth the road ahead of me. And I think I've actually grown up with a certain amount of script that other people can go out and do the less pleasant tasks in life, that I don't have to confront awkward people or awkward situations. And I think maybe the scripts is the fact that people don't outgrow what's a good system for a child. It's a good idea for a child to rely on its parent to sort things out for them. But I think as you grow older, you've got to just put that aside and say, look, now I'm the adult and it's time I shouldered responsibility for these tasks.
Well, that's part of maturing.
Exactly. So it's almost like you've got trapped in the decisions that were correct for a child and not grown out of them. And it doesn't have to be bad ones. It's just ones that have got stuck and are no longer appropriate for your stage in life.
Yes, but seldom do I have a client like that. Most of my clients were physically abused, sexually abused, significantly neglected, and they are suffering for a lot of things that we would probably diagnose as borderline personality disorder or obsessive compulsive or schizoid or post-traumatic stress disorder. That's my practice. Has been. So I don't have the privilege of working with people like you, except in my training groups, where I have a number of people who would reflect that. So, but what I would ask you, if we had much more time, is I'd be asking questions about your health maintenance. And how are you taking care of yourself in terms of health maintenance? I'd be looking at what are your relationships in terms of the intimate relationships in your life and your friendships? And can you solve problems? Is your house a constant mess? When you open the closet door, do things come falling out at us and you can't find anything? Or, can you sit down and do your taxes without it being a traumatic experience because you know how to take things just one step at a time? So I'm looking at problem solving, health maintenance, and relationship with people. And if your answer is consistently, that's not a problem, that's not a problem, that's not a problem, then it's not a script. All right? So I think a script is that which inhibits spontaneity and limits flexibility in problem solving, health maintenance, and relating to people. Now, back to the previous question. Do we all have a script? Well, if you take the finita English definition of it, yes, we all have a frame of reference. We're not speaking Chinese. We're speaking English. So we don't have that language frame of reference. We have a certain shared cultural frame of reference. Even though we're on two different continents, we're still in the legacy of a British colonial era, right? That provides us a certain kind of a culture. But I don't think that script, unless it inhibits us in terms of problem solving, health maintenance, and relationship to people. So what's your diagnosis for yourself given that definition?
I don't think I've got a script problem, but I'm happy to recognize that there's always room for improvement in one's activities. So one could always be tidier or more organized or have better relations. But I don't think that it's a crippling problem by any means.
Oh, well, then I would say we're not dealing with script. You're dealing with the foibles of everyday life. Yeah, Karen. Hi.
The time has flown by and we're all so immersed in your exposition of script. I'm wondering if we recontact, if people can stay a bit longer, if you're willing to go over the 2 hours. I am aware that some people might need to
Oh,
leave.
I thought we had until 11 o'clock. I thought we had 3 hours. Ah, okay. I planned a 3 hour. I planned a 3 hour program.
Oh my goodness.
Oh, okay. And I just said to myself, oh, I'm budgeting the time just fine.
Okay.
Well, we can if you all want to stay.
Where
Well,
are
I'd
people
like to stay.
Indonesia, I don't know if there's anyone in India where it's really quite late already in their night, but up to people to stay if they can.
Pooja says yes.
Cool, Pooja.
I'm happy to stay.
Where are you, Pooja?
I'm in Indonesia.
Ah, well, welcome. Yeah. What time is it there? 2 o'clock in the morning?
1 a.m.
1 a.m. Okay. Yeah, let me talk about, just jump topics slightly and talk about relational needs, because this is a concept that many of you may not know about, although it was part of the Eric Berne Award that I got back in, I think, many years ago for an article on relational methods in an integrative transactional analysis. When we're talking here about repressed feelings and needs, let's talk about the needs that are common to all of us. Needs that can only be fulfilled in relationship. And yes, people can temporarily satisfy these needs, but these are needs that have come out of significant interpersonal relationships. They came out of a research project that we did at the Institute for Integrative Psychotherapy that began by asking people what was missing in their previous therapy. So we had 16 therapists doing surveys of their own patients who had previously been in therapy with someone else. And we asked what was good about that therapy and what was missing. Then that took us into another project of asking people about their intimate relationships and what was working and not working in their intimate relationships. And we had a whole list of terminology and needs. And eventually we did a factor analysis and came up with 8, right? The first is the need for security in relationship. This is the visceral experience of having our physical, and emotional vulnerabilities protected. This is the need to be in the presence of someone who you know is not going to hit you. But even more than that, they're not going to insult you. They're not going to demean you. They're not going to shame you. Security is the sense of simultaneously being vulnerable and in harmony with another person. It includes the absence of both actual or anticipated impingement or danger. So it's knowing that I can be with this person, right? What do we do in therapy? Therapeutic attunement involves an empathetic awareness of the other person's need for security in relationship, and then a reciprocal response in which the other's vulnerability is honored and preserved. It communicates, often non-verbally, your needs and feelings are normal and acceptable to me. And that's part of the message that is so important in a relationally focused psychotherapy. And it's that need for security in relationship. And when that need is not met, then the person engages in all kinds of compensating activities, either physiologically, emotionally, or cognitively. The second is the need for validation, affirmation, and significance in relationship. Not just the need of this little boy. It's my need as an 80-year-old man, right? All of us have these needs. All of these needs we're talking about are the needs throughout our lifetime. These are the needs about being in relationship from infancy through school age, even into our old age. And what we need from other people is validation, affirmation, and significance in relationship. So in a way, Karen, by inviting me to come to this, by all of you being here, you provide a sense of significance back to me. And I hope in the things I say and in our engaging in dialogue, I'm providing the same for you. This is the need to have the other person validate the significance and function of our interpsychic process of affect, fantasy, and our personal construction of meaning. What do we do in psychotherapy? It's our affective reciprocity with the client's feelings, validates the client's affect, and provides affirmation and normalization of the client's relational needs. So it's the reciprocity of how we'll be there. You know, look at this therapist here. It's in her look. It's in her touch. It's in her patience that she's validating this woman's feelings. The third is acceptance by a stable, dependable, and protective other person. Look at this little boy's leaning on what I suspect is his grandmother's shoulder as she reads him a book that he's not quite able to read for himself. But it's our need, all of us, to have reliable information, to have guidance and wisdom, to have protection from one's own interpsychic conflicts and escalation of affect. It's just to have somebody who we look up to. As Bowlby said, we all need somebody who is stronger, wiser, and more mature than we are to guide us. This is true whether you're a kindergarten age child like this little boy in the red shirt, or whether you're an old person in the hospital, but relying on the wisdom of your doctors. How does this show up? Sometimes it shows up in therapy as the client idealizing the therapist. Contrary to psychoanalysis, contrary to some TA therapists, this is not a pathological reaction. I think of that kind of idealization as a desperate request to have someone I can rely on and draw strength from, somebody who's going to protect me. The degree to which an individual hopes that someone will be reliable, consistent, and dependable is directly proportional to the quest for interpsychic protection. The need for self-expression, containment, or beneficial insight. This is why, Sharon, when you talked about this woman coming to see you, I suspect she is looking to you to provide that interpsychic protection, to listen to her, even if she tells the same painful stories over and over again. You provide some kind of containment, and I suspect you're providing some kind of beneficial insight, even though it might be too small for you to recognize. Therapeutic reciprocity, then, when the person needs to be accepted by somebody stable, dependable, and protective. The therapeutic reciprocity involves being consistent, reliable, and dependable. And that is the therapeutic thing that we need to provide. This is the client-centered reason, then, to conduct our lives and psychotherapy practices ethically and morally, because our client is depending on us. And most ethics codes are written to protect the association. I remember the American Psychological Association, and the first statement is, this ethics code is designed to protect the profession of psychology. Well, I'm talking about a client-centered reason for acting ethically and morally. It's because our clients need us to be consistent, reliable, and dependable. Now, having a shared experience, having our self-validated affirmation and significance in relationship is when our clients may need us to share some of our own personal story. They may need to know, have you had difficulties like that in your marriage, and how have you managed them? Or did you ever suffer from anxiety like I did? And how did you overcome that? So this is when the need is for validation and affirmation. They often require that the therapist do some self-revealing of their own story, usually judiciously and in limited amounts. When they need someone to look up to, I lost my slide. When they need somebody to rely on, they need you to be like a sterile instrument. They don't want to know, how did you solve your marriage difficulty? They don't want to know how you overcame your anxiety. They want to see you as somebody who is perfectly clean and not contaminated by life, right? So this is where there's literature is often at odds. Some literature says, oh, the therapist has to be aloof, non-revealing of themselves because you interfere with the therapy. Well, that's true if they need somebody to really rely on. But if they need a shared experience, they need their own experience validated, that's when it's important to tell them something about yourself. So here we're talking about confirmation of personal experience. This is when we tell them about our experience. To have life's experience confirmed through mutuality and a shared experience. I chose this picture because I think this couple is having a wonderful shared experience. It looks like they're looking at a travel brochure and planning a getaway, maybe even a second honeymoon together. But it's that shared experience of doing something with someone else. And that's when our clients need us to share a judicious amount of our own experience. The need to have one's experience confirmed is manifested through the desire to be in the presence of someone who is similar and who understands because he or she has had a like experience. Just before COVID, I had a wonderful experience of that. I was in a workshop and one of the mature women in the group took her little notebook and she started, see this gesture? Can you see me? Doing this. And all the other women in the group looked up at her, nodded their head, and had a little smile on their face. There was a connection of sisterhood. They all knew what was going on. Nobody had to say anything, but they had that mutually shared experience together. Reciprocity is provided then by the psychotherapist revealing carefully selected personal experiences, prudently sharing vulnerabilities, similar feelings, personal stories, or fantasies. But most of all, by being personally present and vital. The client's fantasies have a significant interpsychic and interpersonal function. And this is how do we join them? How do we have a shared experience? By focusing on the function of the fantasy. When the function is acknowledged, appreciated, and valued, the person feels affirmed in his or her sense of a shared experience. The fifth one that we found in our research is the need for self-definition. To know and express one's uniqueness and to receive acknowledgement and acceptance from another. Look at this fantastic guitar player. What amazing fantasies must be going on in his mind as he plays that guitar and jumps around on stage in front of a huge audience. Except here it's only in his fantasy. But he's searching for a definition of himself. This is why we engage in a lot of phenomenological inquiry. By consistently engaging in phenomenological inquiry that I wrote a whole book about called Beyond Empathy. But that focus on phenomenological inquiry, every attempt to answer those questions is more and more self-defining for our clients. Self-definition is the communication of one's self-chosen identity through the expression of preferences, interests, and ideas without humiliation or rejection. The expression of self-definition may take unconscious adversarial forms, such as a person who begins sentences with no, even when agreeing, or constantly engages in arguments or competition. I once had an older man in therapy who began every sentence with no. He didn't even hear it. So we finally got a tape recorder and just left it on for him to listen to his own beginning the sentences with no. Well, it was interesting. This man had grown up in a very brutal, controlling mother who had no opportunity to find himself. He then entered a monastery to become a priest when he was 12 years old, in a very rigid order that he was in silence until he was 22 years old. And then he came out and had other jobs in the priesthood and finally quit being a priest. but he had never, through all of his formative years, had a chance to define himself, to express his own uniqueness. So it began starting every sentence with a subliminal no. Right? It looked like it was adversarial, but it was really his attempt to try to define himself. What is our therapeutic reciprocity? It occurs when psychotherapists consistently supports the client's expression of identity and normalizes their need for self-definition. Such attunement requires the therapist's consistent presence, contactfulness, respect, even in the face of disagreements. Number 6, the need to make an impact. Ah, look at this woman. She's trying to get that message across. It's that sense of agency and efficacy, to influence another in some desired way, to affect a change in the other person. We all have that. In fact, that's probably one of the reasons why many of you may have entered this profession. You've wanted to help people change. You wanted to make an impact, right? That becomes an important need. Why am I teaching this? It's my need also to make an impact, to hope to influence you in a way that will influence your clients and provide everyone with a better sense of well-being. An individual sense of competency in relationship emerges from their ability to attract another's attention and interest. It emerges from with our ability to influence the interests of the other person and to affect a change in affective behavior in the other. Right? So we all have the need to make an impact, whether it's a little kid saying, "Daddy, pick me up and hold me." Whether it's you saying to your spouse, "Sit and really listen to what I have to say." Or for you determining what's going to happen to you in your old age. We all need to make an impact. And what's the therapeutic reciprocity to the client's need to have an impact? It occurs when the therapist allows him or herself to be emotionally impacted by the client, to respond with sensitivity. Reciprocity may include soliciting the client's criticisms of the therapist's behavior and making the necessary changes so the client has a sense of impact within the therapeutic relationship. I often do that in my own work, and I teach that in the supervision of how to make use of what we call a relational inquiry. I'll give you an example. A client's been telling a story, blah, 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 and I might say to them, "You know, for 10 minutes, I've just been sitting here listening to you. I haven't said anything. What happens between us when I sit and listen and I don't say anything?" What I'm asking them to do is influence me, to make an impact on me. Or a client may have told me a story, it reminds me of something, and I may have told a story about myself. And then I might say to them before the session is over, "You know, what's it like for you? You were telling me a story about you, and I shared a story about how was that for you?" And a client might say, "Oh, that took me off on a tangent. I don't like it." Or that some client might say, "Yes, that was good for me." But I'm inviting them to make an impact on me. Number 7, and this one is, I think, hard for some TA therapists who've been told, "Be careful about rescuing." Well, you know, there are some clients that really need us to be rescuing. They need somebody else to take responsibility, to take the initiative in making interpersonal contact. So here you are on a Wednesday evening, and you haven't seen some client tonight. Could you maybe consider picking up the phone and say, "You know, We didn't have our session on Wednesday evening, but you're just in my thoughts. I just want to leave you a message to let you know that I'm thinking about you, even though we don't have a session. That kind of reaching out and doing for the other person. When the client's need is to have the other initiate, it may be necessary for the therapist to reach out to the client in some way, to begin a dialogue, to move out of his or her chair and sit near the client, or to phone the client between sessions. And I think that many TA therapists have often overlooked this opportunity because they are worried about rescuing. I think it's in the psychotherapist's willingness to initiate impersonal contact or take responsibility for a major share of the therapeutic work, normalizes the client's need to have someone else initiate a relational connection. And the eighth one in our research is the need to express love. Look at this little girl. Oh, kids are powerful lovers. And we all have the need to demonstrate our gratitude, our thankfulness, our affection by doing something for another person. The importance of the relational need to give love, to give it, whether it be from children or parents, sibling, teachers, or from client to therapist. The need to give love is often overlooked in the practice of psychotherapy. And what is the therapeutic reciprocity? It includes accepting the client's expression and of appreciation, gratitude, and affection by receiving it gracefully. I remember many years ago attending a workshop that had run way over time. We were supposed to stop at 6 o'clock at night. We didn't stop until 8:30 at night. The therapist had worked so very hard. He was exhausted, and we all went to dinner. And while we were waiting in this Chinese restaurant to be served, I saw his stiff neck and how tired he was. So I came behind him and I started to massage his shoulders. And he turned to me and said, "What are you manipulating me for? What do you want from me?" And it was like he stuck a knife in my heart. His comment hurt because I was so grateful and thankful for what he had done for the group that I wanted to give him something back. But look at this teacher here. She's not rejecting his apple. She's just accepting it gracefully. So here we are. I'm talking about 8 relational needs. The need for security, the need for validation, the need to have someone to rely on, the need for a shared experience, the need for self-definition, the need to make an impact, the need to have someone initiate, and the need to express love. What I have not done is talk about the need to receive love. Any idea why? Why in our research we did not come up with the need to receive love? Any guesses? Sharon?
Because it's not, the therapy is not there for the therapist, it's for the client.
Even for the client. They don't have the need to receive love. What didn't show up in our research?
I thought you were talking about the therapist.
No. The need to receive, the people don't talk about the need to receive love because if they're secure in the relationship, if they have validation in the relationship, if the other person is reliable, consistent, dependable, if they can define themselves, if they can make an impact, Right? All of those are the things of receiving love. And then we have the need to express our love. And so for many of our clients, then, when I'm thinking about working with the script system, I'm always coming back to what needs were not sufficiently satisfied throughout their childhood. Now, there's nothing we can do now that they are grown up. We can't turn the clock back 40 years and respond to those needs, but we can identify them. We can talk about the significance of them, how they coped when those needs were not met, and we can respond to today's relational needs as they emerge in the psychotherapy or in our counseling, in our business consulting, whatever we do. Okay, somebody was on my screen a moment ago with his hand up, and now I don't see him. Ah,
It's
there
me.
you are. Hello, Alex.
Hi, Richard.
I've just been going blah, blah, blah here. Let's have a dialogue instead.
Thank you. You talked about empathic engagement with clients. And this is something that I practice with my clients, and I find it highly effective for them. And I also find it quite life-giving for me. I don't find it draining.
I missed the first two words that you said.
Empathic engagement.
Okay, that's what I thought you said. Okay.
And recently I was in a webinar where the presenter suggested that instead of engaging empathically with clients, we should engage with them with compassion. And they said when we feel empathically what the clients are feeling, that's not good. The argument being that it leads to burnout. And it really struck me as counterintuitive and not aligned with my own experience, but I saw a number of other people in the webinar nodding their heads. And I'm wondering what your thoughts on this are.
Both are true, depending
Hmm.
depending on who, when, and what's going on. I wrote a whole book about it, and I'd like to invite you to read the book Beyond Empathy. All right, it talks about going beyond empathy. The way empathy has been described, particularly by Carl Rogers, who was a big influence in my life, and by Heinz Kohut, who was also an influence in my psychoanalytic training, is that empathy is putting yourself into the other person's feelings. So if you're sad about something, that I can feel that sadness, I can sense it, I'm in tune with that sadness. Or if you're scared, right, I have a sense of it. But I think empathy, the way I describe it, is useful for a moment or two to sense what you're experiencing. But then you need me to go beyond empathy. Now I give you a short version of what the book is about, right? So that when you're sad, I need to feel that sadness momentarily so that I know the kind of compassion that your sadness needs. If you think of the yin-yang diagram, your sadness is the yin, my compassion is the yang. Now together we have a unity of relationship. We have that affective connection between us. That's attunement, right? You're scared. What you need is not for me to feel that scared other than a moment to alert myself. What you need is my protectiveness. Interestingly, we don't, so that protectiveness. So there I am with my client, and he's telling me about his father is sending him down to the basement to get the strap. He has to go get his own strap and bring it upstairs that his father's going to whip him with. It's happened many times. And he is sitting there in my office, shaking in fear, telling me the story. In my mind, I'm saying nothing out loud. In my mind, I'm imagining myself standing right in front of her father and saying, doing this and saying, you're not going to hit that kid. I'm not going to let you. And he looks up to me in the middle of his fear and he said, you know, I feel so safe telling you this story, even though I'm scared. Right? It happened between us non-verbally. Right? But that's the reciprocity. That's my yin to his yang. Anger. Have you been in a situation where you're angry about something and the person just turns around and walks away and says nothing? What happens to your anger? Or you're angry about something and they explode. They're much angrier than you are. It takes you away. Right? Interestingly, we don't have a word for reciprocity of anger. We have it for sadness, which is compassion. We have it for fear, which is protectiveness. We don't have a reciprocity word for anger. Might be the reason why there's so many people run around angry all the time. I think we need to use a phrase, serious taking. So that when your client, when your wife, when somebody is angry at you, what they need in terms of reciprocity is to take their anger seriously and to allow it to make an impact. Right? That's the attunement. That's the reciprocity to anger. And then we have joy. The client is joyful about something. Daniel Stern, in his book, The Interpersonal World of the Infant, says what they need from us is vitality. They need our vitality, our sense of pleasure in their joy. I learned that the hard way. How to tell you this story that should take an hour to tell you, but see if I get it in 1 minute. I had a woman who had been involved in a lot of promiscuous sex. She finally stopped dangerously promiscuous sex. We did some work about her family relationships during her adolescence and her father's sexual habits. And she was celibate for many, many months in the therapy. And we were really doing some deep personal therapy. I went away to Europe to do a series of workshops. When I came back, she had picked up with a new boyfriend and was all excited. And she looked up and she saw the look on my face. I wasn't excited. I was thinking, oh, script. Here we go again. I go away. She's back into the old pattern. She saw the look on my face. She jumped up and said, I'm out of here. I'm done with this therapy. And she quit. You know, she quit because she didn't get any enthusiasm from me. Well, make a long story short, after my reaching out to her 3 times, she finally came back and took us a long time to resolve it. But she needed my vitality. But I'm too busy thinking, here we go. We're back into the same old promiscuous sexual activities again. All right. So for sadness, they need our compassion. For fear, they need our protectiveness. For anger, they need our taking seriously. And for joy, they need our vitality. That is probably what they were talking about in that workshop. So if you can read Beyond Empathy, I have lots of examples of how I put that into practice.
Thank you. Very helpful.
Brenda, what are you thinking?
You obviously watched my lips. That is just profound.
I was.
No, that was amazing. I've never looked at empathy to compassion, and yet that was a beautiful illustration. So, wow, thank you. Thanks for asking the question.
Okay. And Denise, what's on your mind as we bring this to a close?
I just think there's so much in that. And I think, we practice empathy and then we're afraid of it. And you've just shown you don't have to be afraid to be involved with your client. So that is very special. Thank you.
Yeah. And Pooja, you're far away there in the other end of the world from me, but any comment you want to make?
Yes, Richard. I have two questions. First one is, out of these 8 relational needs, it's possible that multiple needs may emerge for the client.
Simultaneously?
Yeah, that's right. Simultaneously. So,
Can you see this book? Early Affect Confusion? Just came
Yeah.
out 2 weeks, ago. It's called a Relational Psychotherapy for the Borderline Client. That is so typical of the borderline client. That is what's so frustrating to therapists, because they present one need, you start to respond to that need, and before you've really completed doing that, another need is there and another need is there. And it's like all of these needs are becoming figural. They're demanding attention at the same time.
mhm.
Yeah.
So in such situation, what would be an appropriate approach?
Slow down. We're going to talk about one need at a time,
Mhm.
which is frustrating to them because they take that as a rejection.
Mhm.
To also keep in mind that many of the needs that your clients are going to be talking about were the needs of their childhood.
Mhm.
And, you know, you can't satisfy those childhood needs. You can help them become aware of those needs, to validate the significance of those needs, and to talk to them, how do they manage, how do they self-stabilize in that situation? And we can respond to today's relational needs. For example, it's the end of a session. I've got somebody already in the waiting room. We start to conclude a session and my client says, oh, I forgot to tell you, my mother's just been diagnosed with cancer and I'm so worried about that. Can I stay and talk longer? So what do? Do I satisfy that need? Well, I need a break. I got somebody else waiting for me. Do I reject that need? Or do I recognize it, talk about the significance and say to her, of course you need to talk about that. And that's very important for us to talk about. And it's going to take longer than 10 minutes. You need a lot more time to talk about that. How about coming back in 2 days and we'll devote a whole session to that. That's recognizing the need, responding to it, but not trying to satisfy it. Right. And that's what I do a lot of with those kinds of clients, Pooja.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you, Richard. And the other bit was around what you shared about the reciprocity. Found it very interesting.
Wait, say it again, Pooja. I missed your accent.
Sure. The reciprocity, what you shared.
Reciprocity. Yeah.
Yes. So this can be used for all relational needs, like any one relational need that comes up, that can be applicable there as well. It could be applicable anywhere. So more uniform.
Sure. And I wish we had time for you to give me some specific examples, but I think we're running out of time rather quickly here with our extra hour because I have an appointment in 15 minutes. So, yeah. But I still have the time to answer any more questions or listen to stories if you have.
Can I ask?
Marja? Huh? Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Christy.
Okay. There was a phrase you used when you spoke about the need for self-definition, and that was the phenomenological inquiry. And I wondered what you meant by that.
Again, if I can sell a book so I can make 35 cents, that's how much I make per copy. That's what the book Beyond Empathy is a lot about: phenomenological inquiry, historical inquiry, relational inquiry. Phenomenological, another way to say it, was be subjective experience. or personal experience inside. The phenomenology in that sense refers to the inner process within someone that we cannot know except by drawing it out. So every time we ask a question like, what are you feeling? And what are you thinking about right now? And what's happening in your body? And what does that remind you of? Those are all questions, but you could also say more about that, or, you know, elaborate on that. Every time we're engaging in that, we're inviting them to define themselves and to express themselves in relationship with somebody who's taking them seriously, who's listening to them, who's attentive to them. And that increases the person's sense of self-definition. And many of our clients have grown up in families and in school systems where there was no way for them to ever really define themselves. And that becomes a very important part of psychotherapy. We know from the research on child development, and particularly on attachment patterns, that people with insecure attachment patterns, particularly anxious and avoidant attachment patterns, have an inconsistent and incomplete narrative about their own life, and contradictory. And so by engaging in a consistent phenomenological inquiry over time, we help people form a consistent, comprehensive, and articulate life narrative. And when people do that, we notice that there's a big drop in their anxiety or depression. And that's the process of an ongoing relational psychotherapy. What are you thinking?
Yeah, it makes sense. I've heard the term phenomenological before, and I think I had a slightly different understanding of it, but this broadens that for me.
Well, it begins in the German philosopher Herzl, who at the turn of the 1900s was writing about phenomenology. And he influenced Martin Buber, Paul Tillich, and Kierkegaard, the European existential philosophers. And it had a lot to do with influencing the development of Gestalt therapy. So read Beyond Empathy. I think you'll have a lot more answers to your question in that book. Or if you want something cheaper, look at the 1996, October 1996 Transactional Analysis Journal. And I have an article in there on phenomenological inquiries. It's called Methods of an Integrated Transactional Analysis.
Where is Beyond Empathy?
Or the article in
available?
1993 in the from, in your case, probably it's easier for Amazon. Or you can get it, let's see, that through Routledge. In fact, just today, I have been in, Routledge is going to continue to publish the book. It's just been accepted in their Classics in Mental Health series as a classic in the field. So you're the first people I've told that about. Yeah.
Wonderful.
If you want to see phenomenological inquiry in action, this new book, Psychotherapy, A Healing Relationship, published by Phoenix in London, but it's also on Amazon, this is the transcripts of real therapy session with real clients, and it comes with video. So if you look on page 147, there's a secret code. And that secret code tells you how to get the videos. And then you can read the book, read my explanation, and watch the therapy unfold. So it's called The Healing Relationship, Phoenix Publishing. Harpel, do you want to say what your heart means?
To be honest with you, I was very interested in the scripts. It's so nice to speak to you. I find it a bit of a oh gosh, what can I say? I can't believe I'm talking to you. That's what I can say.
Oh, just pretend we're sitting across your kitchen table having a cup of coffee.
This is so strange. But you know, I am being bold, and I was going to do a workshop on scripts as well, and I find it very interesting, and I'm going to relate it to the educational script. So when you mentioned a little bit about schooling, how and adolescence and how how people felt, I suppose I wanted to know a little bit more about that. Why do people make the decision to do a job that maybe they don't want to do? Or maybe I know how to answer that myself. But how do I get that bit of information out of clients, people, etc.? Am I making sense?
Oh yeah. You're making sense, but your question is so big.
Big,
I mean,
yes.
there's many
Got to
techniques for
unravel,
dealing with
yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Things like psychodrama, having people do imaginary work, having them bring in pictures of their childhood, just having them imagine the various classrooms they've been in. And school can be either wonderfully enlightening in someone's life. A good school system can compensate for a bad home. A good home can compensate for a bad school system. The kids who are in trouble are the ones who have both the bad school system and the bad home. I think most of the damage in my growing up was inflicted in school and on the playground by other kids and by the teacher, and my struggle of being both the smartest kid and the dumbest kid in the class, depending on what subject. There was always, in reading, I was always at the bottom. I couldn't read. Now I read 10,000 pages a year, but in those days I couldn't read it. Yeah, and write. And in those days I couldn't read or write. But I knew everything about geography and science and mathematics, and so I was I went through some crazy times of being laughed at and praised, and sometimes in one day, and that didn't make sense to me as a kid. So schools are very, very harsh on some kids and very liberating for some other kids.
Yeah, schools and parents, I think, as well, because parents have got such a huge influence on their children while they are being schooled, and they both get in the way, don't they? Because the child wants to please the parent sometimes, or it will go, the other way. Oh, I'm not doing what my parents want me to do. So yeah, script messages.
So there you have your math. There you have your mathematics homework, and you've got to get it done before tomorrow. As a parent, do I scream at you? Do it? Do I say, "Oh, you stupid girl, you should know better and do this"? Do I sit down and help you? Do we turn it into a game? Do we make it fun to learn together? Do I give you my time and my patience?
Yeah.
Or do I disregard you? All of those shape the difference of how the kid's going to manage life.
Gosh, well, that's wonderful. It's just great to get your take on all these matters, and I've been looking up the rest of your books as well. So hopefully you'll, hopefully I'll be learning from that.
I wish I knew how to write a smutty murder mystery, something with a lot of blood and sex, and then I could make $1 million.
And that would be very interesting.
There's no profit in writing psychotherapy books.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Richard. It's been awesome. Thank you. Well worth it. Thank you.
Well, Karen, in the couple minutes we have left, anything you want to say to wrap this up?
Personally, having two grandchildren, a 2.5-year-old and a 2-month-old, it's fascinating this time around to get a sense of the formation of script. So there's been a real personal interest for me in that. But I'm going to hand over to Sharon to say the final words, kind of taking me back to those early days in South Africa. Sharon.
One suggestion, though, if you get grandkids that age, go back and read Daniel Stern's Diary of a Baby. It'll really sensitize you as a grandmother.
Thank you.
Enjoy every moment with them.
Sharon, won't you unmute?
Richard, I just want to thank you so much. You know, listening to you this evening brought back memories for me of all the workshops that I've done with you over the many years. And it's really interesting to me to see how you've changed and how you've grown. And it's just very exciting because you've always been my role model. And what I really liked the most about your presentation this evening, even though I know this material, is firstly, there's always something new in it for me. Second of all, your ideas seem to be much clearer. You put them across in a much clearer way than you have done in the past. And it's wonderful to hear that. And third of all, I watched you demonstrating all the ideas that you were talking about in your handling of the group. And it's just lovely to watch that. So I thank you so much for everything that you've taught me over the years.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to be here. I loved the years I was traveling to South Africa regularly, and certainly being there when so many people had the hardship of not knowing what was going to happen. And if it weren't for the long airplane ride, I'd happily come again. But
yeah,
you're unfortunately 28 or 30 hours away from here. But I wish you all well. I think of you often in that country of sort of like always in turmoil. So I wish peace in each of your lives. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Richard.
Okay, so long.
Very beautiful.
Thank you very much. You're a star in the making. Thank you. You really are wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. You're welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to sign off now.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Well, thank you.